I'm back at it again. I called into Capturing Christianity to talk with famous creationist Frank Turek, author of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And I had some questions for Frank about arguments for the existence of God. Let's listen.
On this, but let's turn to the next caller. So this one is Grayson. He was actually he called in with Cygart. Is that who it was, Grayson, that you called in with? Yes, Cygart. And you've got a YouTube channel as well. Tell me the name of it again. Base Theory. Oh, you need to unmute. Sorry about that.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. My channel's called
without volume, without audio. Go.
Yeah, my channel's called Based Theory, as in like a well-based theory, or the opposite of a cringe hypothesis.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. What's your question for Frank today?
Yeah, so Frank might call me an agnostic, but I personally identify as an atheist, just that I lack a belief in God. Some people say lack theist. I don't really care what you call it. I'm not here to play a semantic game, but I really like Laplace's response when, he was asked about God and he said, I have no need of that hypothesis. So, Frank, I think that you've addressed this in a lot of ways, but I just want to ask you straight up here, like, I would agree with Laplace that I personally don't see a need for a God in the reality around us. So I would ask you, why is God necessitated by reality? Why is God necessary to explain the world around us?
Because reality is contingent and God is necessary.
Are there no other necessary things? There could be necessitated brute facts of reality. I don't really see how that gets you to a God to explain that. And metaphysically, like in the metaphysical literature, there seem to be three different schools of thoughts on this. There's like foundationalism, where there does need to be this necessary metaphysical ground floor, but there's also infinitism and coherentism, which to my understanding are viewed as equally viable by the consensus of metaphysicists. So how do you respond to that?
I just believe every effect has a cause. And I think we see so many effects. I mentioned earlier, the universe appears to be an effect. So if you reason back to a cause, you're going to get a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause. The fine-tuning of the universe is an effect. So that would require super intelligence to fine-tune the universe to the extreme precision it is. Same thing with biology. The moral law is an effect, that it's wrong to murder people and it's right to love them.
Can we go one by one here? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. But can we go one by one through those? So,
basically what I'm given is the cosmological, teleological, and moral arguments.
Yes. So with like the cosmological argument, I think the first premise is that anything that comes into existence has a cause, something like that. But I personally don't know what it means to come into existence. It seems to me that initial things don't come into existence and therefore do not have a cause necessitated, like if there's any initial things. So I don't really find that convincing. I don't think that the universe is fine-tuned. I would need an argument to establish that as a fact. And then I forget the third point that you brought up. I think morals, but I think that those would be preferences that would evolve for most social organisms.
Grayson, can I ask you a question? I'm just curious, like where your intuitions are on this. So, Josh Rasmussen has brought up this really interesting thought experiment. Take anything that you know of that has a cause, like a computer, say, and then let's just like place that computer at the beginning, like as a foundation or like an initial item, so to speak. Would that remove the need for an explanation for you? If we put that computer and made it an initial item, would you then think that doesn't have a deeper explanation?
I mean, like initial items, I think by definition don't have anything to precede them. So there could be no cause if the computer was initial. I think by definition, if something is initial, then there's nothing to precede it. Nothing itself is not a thing, so it's not an initial. But I don't think that we do see things created out of nothing. So we don't have examples that say that if something is created out of nothing, then it has to have a cause, because what examples do we have of things created out of nothing? Like when you say something comes into existence, all that seems to mean is that it's coming from some prior energy or material. So it's not coming out of nothing. So I would need the argument that for things to come out of nothing, then they need to have a cause.
Yeah, the evidence shows that all matter, energy, time, space had a beginning. And whatever has a beginning.
That's what the evidence shows.
Well, what do you think it does show?
We don't know enough to be able to make such a statement that you made that there definitely is a beginning. I think the majority of cosmologists would take a more agnostic view on that. Like, you can look at the evidence that does suggest, like, from the cosmic microwave background or something, that there was like a time where the universe was much smaller, denser, hotter, more homogeneous. But we don't have a complete theory of physics that's necessary to be able to make a statement like that. The evidence shows that space, time, and matter had a beginning. It gets to a certain point when you try to extrapolate it back to where our actual understanding of physics breaks down. We don't have an understanding of quantum gravity, so we cannot describe what was going on
Yeah,
when you trace
well,
that far back.
according to Alexander Vilenkin, who developed the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem in
Yes.
2006, he says it doesn't matter that we don't have this uh, quantum gravity and Einstein's, we haven't married those up yet. He says any universe that on average has been expanding since the beginning has to have a cause, has to have a beginning. Doesn't say has to have a cause, has to have a beginning. He says even if there's a multiverse, which he believes in, the whole show needs an absolute beginning. Now, he's personally agnostic. He doesn't, he actually said, I don't even think it needs a cause, but he says it had a beginning. Okay.
Yeah, I
So
actually don't know
the
if I agree.
intuition,
Oh, sorry about that.
I was just going to say, what's the odds on favorite?
So, as you can see here, I've been having a little bit of issues with this debate for Frank bringing up so many topics that I can't really address everything that I want to address that he brought up. You see, right here, I tried to object with his characterization of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which is a theorem in physics which posits that inflation had a beginning, but not necessarily that the universe itself had a beginning. But don't just take my word for it. I wasn't able to unpack this properly in the debate, but why don't we listen to what some of the actual founders of this principle say? Remember, it's the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, so let's listen to Alan Guth explain what it's about.
Was working with Arvind Borda and Alex Valenkin to understand what we can learn about how inflation might have started and how far back it could have gone. And in particular, once we realized that inflation could be eternal into the future, it seemed like a very natural question to ask. Could inflation have also been eternal into the past? And what we found was that inflation could not be eternal into the past. What we basically managed to achieve was proving a theorem which says that any expanding region of space-time that has some minimum expansion rate can only go back so far and not infinitely far. So that means that inflation must have had a beginning. It doesn't really say that the universe must have had a beginning, but it says that the universe could not have been expanding forever up until the present time.
But okay, Grayson, okay. You say, Frank was talking about Vilenkin, maybe one of the other three physicists that came up with this principle. Maybe Vilenkin has a different opinion than Guth on this, and maybe that's what Frank is talking about. Let's listen to what Vilenkin has to say about what his own theorem says about whether or not the universe had a beginning or just inflation had a beginning.
The theorem proves that inflation must have a beginning, right? The universe as a whole, the theorem doesn't say that. It says that the expansion of the universe must have a beginning, right?
Oh, okay. So Frank Turek was just completely misunderstanding the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem as well as William Lane Craig, because they both say that this theorem says that the universe had a beginning, but in reality, it just means that inflation had a beginning, and it's agnostic about whether or not there was a beginning to the universe as a whole. Okay. I didn't have enough time to clarify that in the actual conversation, so let's get back to it.
But he says it had a beginning. Okay.
Yeah, I
So
actually don't know
the
if I agree.
intuition,
I'm sorry about that.
I was just going to say, what's the odds on favorite? If in all our experience, every effect needs a cause and the universe is an effect, what's the odds on favorite?
Well, like I said, metaphysically, there are three different alternatives that are all seen as equally viable, to my understanding, by the consensus in the field, like infinitism, foundationalism, and coherentism. I'm not qualified to pick among those three about which is more probable. It seems like the actual experts don't have a consensus agreement on that.
What are the differences between those three?
Like foundationalism obviously has this like metaphysical ground floor that you would say is a god, but there are other potential things that could be other than a god. That's foundationalism.
Like what? What could
Infinitism
it
is
be?
basically an infinite regress, which is not mathematically, logically, physically. You can't rule out an infinite regress. And then coherentism is basically that things ground each other laterally rather than needing this hierarchical step of contingent causes. So
Yeah, you the second one you said there that you can go on an infinite regress. I don't know many philosophers that would suggest you could. For example, if there were an infinite number of days before today, would today have ever arrived?
sure, yeah.
How would today have arrived if you had to live an infinite number of days before this one?
Because again, an infinite amount of things, you can take a slice from any of that infinity. This is integrable at any one point. You can get a set data from that. So
Right, but
I don't see
you
why it
can't
would.
traverse an infinite number of days. You can imagine an infinite number of days,
Yeah.
but if you were
I'm
born an
not saying that we
infinitely long,
traverse an infinite number of days to get here, but you can have past infinites, you can have future infinites. I'm not aware of any logicians, philosophers, mathematicians, or physicists that say that you cannot have a past infinite universe.
how much reading have you done on this?
No, I mean I've looked into it from cosmologists like Sean Carroll. I've looked at it from like conversations I've had with cosmologists at my local university. I've looked at William Lane Craig even has said that there's no logical or physical or mathematical impossibility with an infinite past regression. Even William Lane Craig has said that. He says that his issue is metaphysically with that.
William Lane
But
Craig is the top advocate in the world for the Kalam cosmological argument.
yes.
And one of his arguments is that time had to have a beginning because without
If,
time having a beginning, this day would never have gotten here. Now, if time had a beginning, what could have created time?
right.
Only something that's timeless, which
So
is one of the attributes for what we mean by God. Let me ask you
okay, well
this.
you can have okay.
If God existed, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian?
Okay, can I answer that? But I've been trying to get in a word in edgewise real quick. I'll go back to that question, I promise. But William Lane Craig, I can get you the actual quote, the audio of him saying that you can have an infinite regress that's allowed mathematically, physically, logically. He just has metaphysical issues with it, which we could address. But that audio does exist. He did say that. I was not making that up. Valenkin also, I think that he has said that it doesn't necessarily need to be a beginning of the universe. And like what he could be referring to as a beginning, I think is a little bit different than your definition of beginning. And then to answer your question, if Christianity was true, yes, of course I would be a Christian. So yeah, William Lane Craig has actually said this multiple times on multiple different platforms. Here's one where he was interviewing Alex O'Connor.
But what if that just goes back eternally and the universe is eternal? And what you're trying to demonstrate here is that the universe can't be eternal because it leads to logical absurdities.
Oh, not logical, Alex. I would say metaphysical. There's no logical contradiction in the notion of the actual infinite. Infinite set theory is a well understood branch of mathematics. It's perfectly consistent and coherent. But I maintain that when you try to instantiate it in the world of the real,
right,
that then it leads to these absurdities.
And just if that one wasn't clear enough, William Lane Craig has actually said this on Capturing Christianity's own show before. He clarified exactly what he means by those absurdities and that they are metaphysical absurdities and not logical ones.
Now, Alex is certainly right that when we appeal to these absurdities, we are not talking about logical contradictions or incoherences. Jose Bernardet, in his book on infinity, says that there's no logical contradiction involved in these monstrosities, but you have only to look at them in their concrete reality to see that this is metaphysically impossible.
So yeah, I'm not mischaracterizing William Lane Craig's position on this one. This is just straight from the horse's mouth. And then to answer your question, if Christianity was true, yes, of course I would be a Christian.
Okay, so what evidence would you need to see in order for you to say, hey, Christianity's true?
Yeah, I'm not as radical as maybe some other people that, like you talked about earlier. Like if God did come down to me and say, Grayson, Christianity is true, this is all true. If there was something like that I could, interact with, see in front of me, if I could hear, talk to God, whatever, I would probably just believe it. I mean, I would always, in the back of my mind, maybe I would have some doubts about my sanity, but I'm gonna just believe it. I think at that point it would be strong enough evidence.
Okay. By the way, what is
Or
Sean
I can
Carroll?
give you an alternative as well.
Mhm.
The alternative would be if the Bible made like claims or ideas that were then later, like hundreds of years later, verified by the scientific evidence. Like if we did find out that Noah's flood happened, that Adam and Eve happened, if we found out that things that are said in the Bible really were true, and we had scientific evidence to support them, I think that that would be enough evidence to convince me that Christianity is true.
How about prophecy?
Um, Prophecy is a little bit more iffy for me if it's not like scientifically verifiable. Like it's if it's not something about some scientific knowledge that they couldn't have known beforehand, because there are other cultures in the world that also seem to have made prophecies that have come true. Like it was prophesied that the emperor of China would have a certain surname, and then the founder of the Tang dynasty had that surname. Like there are examples with the Oracle of Delphi and other prophecies in other cultures that came true. So for me, that evidence isn't strong enough to convince me specifically of Christianity's truth.
Okay. Yeah, I highly doubt you're characterizing Craig correctly here. And Sean Carroll's position is once you get back to Planck time, we just don't know. And he says, I'm happy with that. Okay.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. He's happy with it, but that's not an explanation. Okay.
Sure.
Also, I might make one other suggestion. And again, it goes back to Ed Fazer. This book would be very helpful. Again, this is not, I'm recommending my books, but I'm recommending other people's books. The Last Superstition. If you read this book with an open mind, Grayson, I think you'll get some good philosophical insights, because he kind of explains a lot of philosophy to the average person like me that doesn't get it unless it's explained in an easy way. And he does a good job of that. There's also another argument for God that we haven't mentioned here. It goes back to Aristotle, and it's picked up by Aquinas, and it's called the fifth way to argue for God. And essentially what it says is that all of nature is going in a direction. That, for example, why does an acorn, if it's properly nourished, always go in the direction of becoming an oak tree?
Entropy.
Why does it become an elm tree or a birch tree or a seahorse? Because it's programmed to become an oak tree. Now, is an acorn conscious? Is an acorn in the ground thinking, all right, what do I have to do to become an oak tree? No.
It's
But
following deterministic laws of physics.
If it's properly nourished, it always goes in the direction of becoming an oak tree. If it doesn't have a mind of its own, and it doesn't, yet it's reliably going in a direction, there must be an external mind directing it toward an end.
That's the leap of logic that I can't follow.
Why does it do what it does?
Because it's just obeying physical laws of
laws. Where do laws come from? Where do laws come from?
Well, laws are descriptions that are made by humans to try to match what's observed in reality. So it just seems like reality is a brute fact. So
before there were humans, were there such a thing as laws?
No, there's just reality. Humans had to construct laws to explain reality and predict it.
There were no physical laws before humans. There was no laws of physics, no laws of chemistry.
Oh, those are obviously constructions used to describe reality. Reality still existed.
Yeah.
The laws themselves.
Okay, I see what you're saying, but the laws, the forces that we're describing by laws, did they exist?
Yes.
Okay, so they existed. Why did they exist? And why do they do the same thing over and over again?
So is this kind of like asking why is there something rather than nothing?
No, I think it's something. the question is,
I clicked the wrong scene. I was going to say, just to kind of help clarify a little bit. It seems like this is almost like a fine tuning type question. Robin Collins has his version of the fine tuning argument. He does have one that actually looks at it from the perspective of like the set of natural laws. Like obviously you can look in particular at like the constants, the actual values of those constants, and wonder, why do they take those constants specifically? But you can also ask more generally, why is there something like a law of gravity at all? So there's two different ways to kind of cash it out. So this is, I think, what Frank is kind of getting at is like more of like a fine tuning type.
So I think that I can actually use Frank's argument from earlier to answer this question of fine tuning, because earlier a caller asked Frank, about other potential worlds where God created people that have free will but freely choose not to commit murder or whatever. And Frank responded with that as saying like, well, all we have is the world that we're in. So could those other possible worlds exist? Sure, I don't know, but why would we think about them if this is the only world that we have?
You've created another world where, say, we did less evil, or you and I didn't even exist, perhaps, but we don't know. All we know is the world we have.
That's how I feel about fine tuning, is that I would need an argument that's saying that those other possibilities where maybe a certain law of physics behaves a certain other way, why should I believe that those are actual possibilities? Why should I think that those exist, and that this is really a universe that you have to dial in everything to a certain exact value out of a potential range of values? I don't see a reason to think that the universe is that way, when just in reality, every time we make an observation, these values are the same. The laws of physics are the same whenever we check. So I would just say that it's the empirical track record. And it just seems to be that reality is that way as a brute fact.
Here's one way to think about it: is take the hypothesis that atheism is true, or that no God exists, or that naturalism is true, whatever, and then ask the question, well, what is the probability that we would observe the world that we do? A world, we can just limit it to the world with the set of laws that we have. Do you think that atheism predicts this type of world, or?
I think that the question is kind of incoherent, because you can't do probability calculations if your sample size is 1. Like, we can't look at any alternatives or possibilities or ranges to determine an actual probability for our universe, because it's just 1 out of 1. We only have one universe to compare to.
Yeah, the problem is, though, of the 3 possibilities for fine tuning, one is physical necessity, which is what you're saying. The other is chance, which really isn't a cause at all. It's just a description of mathematical possibilities. And the third is design. There aren't many cosmologists that I know of that say that this universe physically is necessary to exist as it does. And to say, you seem to be given a version of the anthropic principle which says, well, of course we couldn't observe these attributes of our universe the way they are unless they were the way they are, so we could exist. But that doesn't explain why we exist. It would be like, as philosopher John Leslie said, imagine you were put before a firing squad of 100 trained marksmen on trumped up charges, and you hear the ready, aim, fire, and you hear the guns go off, and then you observe you're not dead. Does the fact that you can observe you're not dead explain why they all missed? No, it doesn't explain why they all missed. You're saying, oh, maybe this was maybe just trying to scare me. They had blanks in their guns, or they deliberately aimed away, right? Because you exist doesn't explain why they all missed. And when you look at our universe, as even atheists, I mean, it's not really even controversial that the universe is fine-tuned. I mean, even Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins said this is the hardest one to answer. The question is, why is it fine-tuned?
Grayson, it does also seem like the response that you gave to the question that I asked also assumes a specific interpretation of probability called frequentism. Are you familiar with that interpretation?
Like the idea of like an objective probability, right? Rather than like a subjective.
Yeah, but it's based on frequencies and trials. So like you said, there is no other trials that we can sort of compare this to. That faces there's pretty significant problems with that, but we don't have to rely on that interpretation of probability. We could rely on Bayesianism. There's other interpretations.
I would just say those three different options that Frank put out, I think that those are the only three options if we have a complete knowledge of physics and the mechanisms of the universe. Like, if we had a complete understanding, then those are the three options, right? But when we don't have a complete explanation, like it could be that these are necessitated, like the laws of physics are necessitated by some more underlying physics. But I think that because we lack a complete theory of the universe, a complete working understanding of the universe, then I don't think that I'm certainly not saying that these are necessary. These values of the constants and the laws are necessary. I'm just saying that I don't see a reason to like think that they're fine-tuned. I personally don't think that the universe is fine-tuned. I don't think we can declare that as if it's a true fact of the universe because I don't think that we know enough to be able to have any sort of certainty or confidence in declaring that the universe is fine-tuned. Like you can change numbers in a formula around and that can change the outcomes, but I'm just seeing that as happening on paper or in the heads of the physicists manipulating these variables around. I don't see a reason why I should think that that's reflective of actual possibilities for reality. So I'm not saying that these things are brute facts. I'm just saying I don't know enough to say that.
Well, a minute ago,
Frank, one more response from you, and then we'll turn to another caller.
I was going to say a few minutes ago, you were claiming somehow that cosmologists, the consensus was we didn't know how the universe began. And yet now and I don't even think that's true, but now you're saying that the consensus view that the universe is fine-tuned is wrong. Because
I don't think that that's a consensus view by any means.
Oh, it surely is. It surely is. It's far and away the majority view among cosmologists. That's why even atheists are admitting. That's why they come up with the multiverse. Nobody would be talking about the multiverse if this universe didn't appear fine-tuned.
I think that there are plenty of other reasons to be talking about a multiverse that have nothing to do with fine-tuning, but I think that what they mean by fine-tuned is a little bit something different than you mean by fine-tuned. They're just talking about in their actual equations, if they change the values of constants or the way that these laws work, then they get different results. And that's what they're talking about with fine-tuning. But that doesn't reflect that the universe is fine-tuned in the way that you're talking about, where it needed to be created a certain way.
As Hawking himself said, if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1 part in 1,000 million a second after the Big Bang, the universe would have collapsed back on itself or never developed galaxies. It's on a razor's edge. So that's Hawking.
Doesn't mean that it could be, though. It doesn't mean that it could have been different.
It wouldn't be here if it hadn't banged just like it did. But we can. By the way, the argument I was going down, which we didn't have a chance to complete, was Aquinas's fifth way, which is not a Big Bang cause. It's a present cause that you need a mind right now to keep the universe doing what it's doing. But that's what Phaser will help you with.
Okay, I'll take a rain check on that.
All right.
Grayson, I really do appreciate you calling in. I've enjoyed every time that you've called, so feel free to call again in the future. I did want to mention though, have you checked out any of Luke Barnes' work on fine tuning?
Luke Barnes, no, I'll have to look into that.
Okay, he wrote a book with an atheist. I think he's atheist. He could be agnostic. A physicist that is definitely not atheist. It's called A Fortunate Universe, and they talk about fine tuning. They have a really good chapter on like what that means, but they both agree that it's true. And they're both physicists, so you should check out that book.
I would just clarify that I think that you can find physicists who will say it's fine-tuned, but you can also find others that will say it's not. I don't think that there's a consensus in the physics community about whether or not the universe is fine-tuned, because I don't think that there's evidence for these other possible universes. And if there's not evidence that you could have these different values, then I don't think that there's evidence for fine-tuning. That's where I'll leave it.
Okay. All right. Thanks for calling in, bud.
So let's just recap what you just listened to, right? So I asked Frank, what are the arguments that a God is necessary to explain our universe? And Frank kind of started with the cosmological argument, then retreated from there. Then he went to fine-tuning, retreated from there. He brought up the moral argument, retreated from there. He keeps like coming up with these arguments. and then retreating, changing the subject, asking me, well, if Christianity was true, would you believe it? What would it take to convince you? You know, like shifting around the questioning. And then eventually, you know, I shoot down each one of his arguments with my own response to them. And then finally he says, well, okay, I didn't actually make it to the real argument. I wanted to talk about Aquinas' fifth way, but we didn't get there. And that's my real argument for why God's existence is necessary. But you should have just started with that one, Frank, honestly. Why not just start with your strongest argument right out the gate? And then we could discuss that rather than discussing all of these other details about what would make me accept Christianity and then not get to the actual argument that you think is the best one or the real one, the one that you actually think is the most convincing. So maybe I'll just have to take a rain check on that one, but something tells me that the arguments were not getting better. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that. I've personally been enjoying calling into this new call-in show that Capturing Christianity is doing. Been having a lot of fun with that. So let me know, like the video if you liked it, comment if you had any criticisms, any comments about any of my arguments, anything that you wanted clarification on. And remember, stay tuned and keep learning and subscribe for more.